How's everyone doing tonight? Good. My name's Loren Schoenberg. I'm the executive director of the Jazz Museum in Harlem, and I've been looking forward to tonight for so many reasons. And we'll talk about that in just one moment. I want to thank everyone for coming. But before we do, just a little bit of background for those that are here for the first time. The Jazz Museum in Harlem is an organization that has been operating out of these offices for over 4 years now. We're into the third year of our Harlem Speaks series. And if you look around the room, you'll see on the wall all these photographs. And this is not even the complete set. We have about another 4 or 5 that are waiting to be mounted. But every single photograph that you see, or every single frame, represents a 2-hour interview with a Harlem legend. And sometimes these are folks who actually may not even lived in Harlem for a long time. They may not have ever actually lived in Harlem. They may not be musicians. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But they're people for whom Harlem and for whom jazz has a very, very important part in their lives. And mostly musicians, but there's one particular kind of individual without whom the musicians wouldn't be here. And these are the people who make it possible for the art to happen. And again, that's another thread I will be dangling just for a moment. As I continue, between Harlem Speaks, we have our educational programs running currently at the Thurgood Marshall Academy. We completed the last semester at the Frederick Douglass Academy. We're currently at the Thurgood Marshall, sponsored by the Gilda Lehrman Foundation. Our children's youth band, the Jazz Museum in Harlem Youth Ensemble, which played at our fundraiser last Sunday, which is sponsored by the Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation and is done in collaboration with the Children's Aid Society, is going great guns. And again, we're announcing that starting next fall, thanks to support that we got from the Musicians Performance Fund and also from the Jervis and Constance Doctorow Family Foundation, going to be able to present free live music all throughout the year in Harlem. We're going to alternate. Thursday nights are going to be Jazz Museum in Harlem night, starting in the fall. Every other Thursday will be this series, the interview series. And then also on the alternate Thursdays, we're going to have these live concerts. In addition, I think I'm going to start teaching for free, I think. We're going to start having jazz education courses for free up here in Harlem. And if Christian's in town, I know he'll join in, and our other members of our faculty. So we're really going to start burgeoning. The growth is really going to start in the fall. There's a lot of other stuff going on, which I'll talk about when we come back, but now it's my pleasure, before I introduce our guest this evening, to introduce you to my co-director, Kristen McBride.
Thank you very much, Loren. I must say it's so great to be back home among the brethren and sisterin of the community. For the last 3 months, I've been traveling around to mostly Australia and Thailand and Singapore and New Zealand, and as I told Loren when I got home a few days ago, this is the truth. Almost everywhere I went in all of those countries, at least 2 or 3 people would ask me, hey, so tell me about this jazz museum in Harlem. So that's my word to you, that this is getting around the world by all kinds of ways. Certainly as the ambassador of the Jazz Museum, I'm doing my best to spread the word as best I can, but it's beating me to the punch. So the impact that you all have made with your support, I want you to know, is causing a great wave all over the world, not just here in New York City, but all over the world. And if I must tell you a quick story about our guest tonight, do you mind if we talk about what happened at the Frederick Douglass Academy? That was in November of last year. We were honoring Charles Rangel at the Frederick Douglass Academy. And as the night progressed, it turned into one of the most wonderful reunions that some of you were there. Dr. Billy Taylor came up on stage, and our guest tonight came up on stage, and Loren and I just got out of the way. They started to reminisce, and it was the most wonderful, beautiful thing I've ever witnessed in a very, very long time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Loren and let him hand it off.
Well, as I said before, you know, it takes musicians to make music, and I'd just like to acknowledge in the audience, we do have some of our former guests of Harlem Speaks. And I'd like to mention the great bassist educator, Mr. Larry Ridley, who is here. And right over here, we have legendary dancer and historian Taja Jackie Murdoch. And I think I know almost everybody in this room because this is a wonderful, wonderful assumption. Well, anyway, it takes musicians to play music, but without the people behind the scenes who let the artists create the art and find the support for them to do it, we would be trees falling in the forest that nobody would hear. So I'm thrilled and been looking forward so much to an evening with Mr. Artem.
Yes.
A long introduction.
Good, thanks.
Here you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Everyone, just so you understand the format for tonight, these recordings are videotaped and they're part of the archives of the Jazz Museum in Harlem, but also will become, I think, major parts of any archival story on the history of jazz and the history of jazz in Harlem. So some of the questions that we ask, the answers may seem patently obvious to us and to you, but again, we're not only speaking to each other, but we're also speaking, frankly, to the future through the interview. So I'd like to get some basic biographical things, Arthur, out of the way, and ask you where and when you were born.
I was born right here in Harlem on March 22nd, 1930.
Okay. Where were you born and where were you raised?
I was, as I said, I was born in the Polyclinic Hospital on 50th Street. I was raised right here in Harlem. On 138th Street.
Okay.
Yeah. On Fifth Avenue. The last house on Fifth Avenue, the last residence on Fifth Avenue, 2256. Yeah.
Well, as I understand it, back in those days, Harlem was divided into various neighborhoods. People who lived on one side of an avenue, people who lived on the other side, people who lived in the 130s, the 140s, the 150s. Could you paint a picture for us of the neighborhood where you were raised and what it was like?
Well, you're right. It was pretty parochial. I mean, we had people that lived in an area that, for instance, we characterized downtown as anything past 125th Street. You characterize uptown on the other side going north. The areas and neighborhoods, whether it was on Morningside Avenue or whether it was over on Madison Avenue, you had a diversity of people in those neighborhoods. Certainly when I was coming up, Fifth Avenue, between 135th Street and 125th Street, had quite a diverse population, including a Slovakian society that had a building on 127th Street on Fifth Avenue with steps that looked like it was the entrance to a church, and people used to drive up every Sunday and go there for many, many years. So it was a very diverse community. You didn't have all black people. You had a mixture in Central Harlem. 135th Street was a Latino community with Latin stores. Baby Gonzalez was a jeweler on the corner. You had a Puerto Rican barbershop and various mixtures of Latin people integrated with American black people that migrated from the South, and then people from Caribbean islands. And that was the way it looked when I was an infant. As we progressed and went, I attended a Catholic school, St. Mark's School on 138th Street between 5th and Lenox Avenue, which is now, I believe, in its 95th year of serving that community. And it was a very, very important educational institution because it was an option to public schools at a time when education was going on in the Catholic schools and not in the public schools. Does it sound any different or the same? But you see, there was a difference. In the Catholic schools, they did better because they could choose their students. If you didn't toe the line, if you weren't contributing to the class, if you were disruptive, you were out of there because that was the option they had. It was a private school. public school, they couldn't do that. They had to take everybody, whether you were positive or whether you were negative. And so it was at that time that in 138th Street, close to Lenox Avenue, there was a candy store that we congregated in, Mrs. Watson's candy store. And they had a jukebox, of course. And on that jukebox was the leading jazz songs provided by the leading performers of the day. It was in Mrs. Watson's candy store that I first heard Artie Shaw's Summit Ridge Drive by the Gramercy Five. And then, of course, the Johnny Guarnieri quartet with Lester Young and Salam Stewart, Johnny Guarnieri and Sid Catlett. So, but these were vehicles for us to dance. And remember that this music was dance music. And everybody in my era, in my community, could dance. If you couldn't dance, then you were nothing. And ostracized. I mean, you couldn't come out of the house, you know. And we were very, very competitive, of course. And as you deal with jazz music, you also deal with jazz fans that are tempted to hyperbole. Who is the best? And then who is better than who? And all of those kinds of arguments. And I think that's part of the charm of being a jazz fan, that you can argue and try to determine who was better than who. But we all fall into that temptation. This was a time when Billie Holiday was on the jukebox. It was the music we danced to. If it had a beat, then of course we were trying to emulate the professionals at the Savoy, you know, the dancers, and Danny Manning was doing his magic, and Norma Miller was doing hers, and they were world renowned, and people used to come up for those nights at the Savoy where they had the Battle of the Bands. But I digress, because all this is happening in a social context in music and also in the society that we were part of. And I don't think that you can examine the music of a particular time without looking at the social mores that produces this music and the conditions that were prevalent at the time, because they do impact every art form. In fact, they impact every citizen. But as we look at jazz, we're talking now about dance music, we're talking about jazz performers, and we were very sophisticated, we thought. And we knew that Lester Young was really cool and cooler than Coleman Hawkins. and we knew why. And so when the opportunity arose for a friend of mine, Freddie Burkett, who lived on 123rd Street, to bring us down to his house. His family had a brownstone on 123rd Street. He introduced us to his older brother, Earl, who had the first stereo system that I had ever seen in components. There was no cabinet. I said, you know, you couldn't afford a cabinet? How come you? And then he explained the separation and the sound and all of that, and he did it demonstrating to us the great value and artistry of Duke Ellington. And so now I'm exposed to Duke Ellington, and we all become fans of that band. And then we know all of the musicians, and of course the riffs of Ben Webster in Cherokee, and those great solos that band produced over the years. So it was our exposure to the big bands and the tremendously talented musicians that made up that band, generation after generation, you know. And of course, at this time, Count Basie was coming out of Kansas City too, and the music was changing. Louis Jordan had influenced a lot of the music at that time and introducing what we call jump music with that beat there again that we could dance to, and it was a dance specialty, his music. I think that there was a distinct change in my perception of the music after a very influential record came out by Joe Liggins. The Honey Dripper was the name of it, and it was on a 78, but it took up the whole 78, this whole side of the 78. We never saw that before either. And when this record came out, it became an instant hit. And what was it? It was a variation on Boogie Woogie that we knew of from Meade Lux Lewis and Albert Ammons. And they just segued into this other additional rhythm that created a new kind of sound to us and a new expression of our dancing skills. And that was like a bridge until bebop came in. And when that entered our consciousness, and I can tell you exactly when it was because in 1945, my club, we had a club, Charlie and about 17 other teenagers. We formed a club and we gave our first dance in 1945 at the Congress Casino, and we had Freddie Jackson's bebop band. And they were our peers. They were a little older than we were, but they were professional musicians. And we had a fabulous night of great music that was played to an audience made up of our families, our mothers, fathers, and whatnot. Because, you see, we gave this dance on a Monday night. And you know Monday nights aren't popular. And so it was a flop. But that was the first affair that I gave. And I learned something from that. We never did a Monday night again.
Well, I'd like to ask something here on this,
Go ahead.
On this Thursday evening. You mentioned that your parents were at this affair.
Yeah, sure.
And I wonder if we can back up just for a moment and find out about the Barneses. How did they wind up in Harlem? About your mother, about your father, and if you could paint a picture of them for us.
Yes, I can. Both of them are from the Virgin Islands. My mother's from St. Thomas and came here to New York in 1918 from St. Thomas. And it was at that time that the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States. And so they had automatic citizenship. My father was born in St. Croix and raised in Puerto Rico by an aunt. His mother had passed away at childbirth. And so she moved to Puerto Rico, started a laundry business, and that's where he was raised until he came to New York. So and paradoxically, my mother and father met in New York. And at that time, of course, they had very active associations. You had the Sons and Daughters of Barbados, you had the Virgin Islands Association, you had the Jamaica Benevolent Society that used to give the all blue dance, and you had various other associations emanating from the source of immigrants that came to New York City.
Your father's name and your mother's name?
Oscar Wanda Barnes and Oscar Barnes. My father was a professional gambler. By that I mean he made his living gambling. And, but in a very, very narrow area. He only gambled on horses and numbers and sports betting. Nothing else. He never played cards. He never went to a casino. He never believed in that. That was, you couldn't win that. Right. And the gambler's logic. So, yes, it was, and he was quite a character introducing my sister and I had an older sister, to the music early. He took us to to a concert that, at Carnegie Hall that Duke Ellington had in 1943. And we were there, and I was captivated then. And the magic has never worn off.
Tell us about your mother.
Well, she was an extraordinary person. In order to get along with my extraordinary father, she had to be extraordinary. And she was really a very solid, stable person who was an inspiration from the word go. I mean, she was behind you. She was for whatever you were doing that was positive. And so my house became the magnet for all of the group that made up our club. And my father became a surrogate father for a lot of those members of that club that didn't have a father. And he had glamour about him, you know, and the ups and downs of gamblers. Today it's terrific, tomorrow it's zero. And he had great taste, and one of the ups times, he bought the New York Black Yankees baseball team. Yeah. And he owned that for a minute. But it was fascinating because he would take me to the dugout, you know, at the polo grounds. Now remember, this is 14 doubleheaders in the Negro National Leagues, and you had 55,000 people in the polo grounds. And so, you know, I was in the dugout with him and the players, and it was great. It was really terrific. And he did take me to all of the sporting events that he bet on, and he was a great fight fan, and so I was exposed to that. And what was characterized as the sporting life.
Would you mind telling us about your earliest memory of seeing live music or experiencing live music?
Well, I think that it was in my early teens, and certainly that concert, I was 13 at that time, that was very impressionable. But you see, we had the radio, and the radio at that time was the universal medium for this music to be spread across the country. And so you had broadcasts from the West Coast that you heard in the East Coast and vice versa. And that's where we were exposed to the music, so much so that one of the pastimes was to go and buy song sheets. Anybody remember song sheets? Where the lyrics to the songs were written and published, I believe, every week. And so you knew what was happening. The hit parade was on the radio. You followed the songs, you followed the performers, and without a visual distraction like television, you know, concentration and focus was on that medium, and it was quite enjoyable and satisfactory, because you could hear a band and imagine what was going on there as they announced the numbers and performed the solos, and then you started to recognize that when the records came out. Yeah.
Tell us about your first time visiting the Apollo Theater, and who did you see?
Well, I don't remember who the performers were, but it was a regular thing. We used to go, the whole family used to go quite often on the weekends. And you know, they had 5 shows there, and B movies. B, I thought they were E movies. You know. George Raft and all those gangster movies, I mean, that you've seen a million times. But we would sit through at that point I was going with my family. When I got older, an older teenager, we'd go in a group ourselves, and we'd spend the whole day there. And you'd see the show, and you'd know when they made a mistake and when they didn't, and all of that. But it was a very, very important rite of passage in going to shows at the Apollo. Yeah.
Well, then all these wonderful acts at the Apollo, I'm wondering of all the, I guess, dozens, if not hundreds of ones that you must have seen on all those nights, could you just share with us a few memories, let's say, of a dance team, and maybe of a comedian, and maybe of a...
Well, sure.
Just some
well, you got Pigmeat Markham was very big. It was very, very big. Pigmeat Markham was very, very big.
Tell people about Pigmeat Markham who may never have seen him.
Well, it's very hard to describe because we're talking about humor and a time that is not here anymore.
That's right.
So our humor at that time was honed to the taste of the public and at that time. And it was certainly, for us, we had acts that were on the stage that we considered class acts. You had the Miller Brothers and Lois. You had Coles and Atkins. You had certainly, of course, you know, the Nicholas Brothers, and from Brooklyn you had the Berry Brothers, and great tap dancers. And as we talk about the music, you know, bebop music brought in a new wave of tap dancers, and of course the most preeminent of those was Baby Lawrence, who created a whole new style in percussive tap dancing that was pretty much in tune with the new music of bebop. And the expressions of the dancers of his era. Bunny Briggs was a tremendously talented dancer, famous for his tap dance rendition of Duke Ellington's Sacred Concert at St. John the Divine. So you had great, great dancers of that time that were influenced by the music.
I've heard that the audiences at the Apollo could, if they loved you, they were one way.
Oh, yeah.
If they didn't love you, they were another way.
Oh, yeah. And you knew it.
Could you tell us about that?
Well, you know, it came about really from the amateur night on Wednesdays, and with the character called Puerto Rico, who would come out. If you couldn't sing, they'd send Puerto Rico out, and he had a cap gun, and he would shoot you, and they'd put the hook and drag you off the stage. You were humiliated, you know. But if you had something, if you had talent, no matter how raw it was, if you had talent and that audience was so sophisticated and knowledgeable, they could detect it and they would say, no, 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 let us stay, we want to hear. And let them finish or let them start again. And they would, you know, and then stand up and give them applause. So it was not all hostile, but, and it became comical after a while, you know what I mean? And it was not as edgy as one would think. It didn't destroy one's ego. Right. It was done in a lot of fun, you know. But they were tough, and they knew, and you know what they hated? Pretension. Oh man, you have some big name come down there and they're going to do whatever they thought they were going to do, and it wasn't what the audience expected, man. Hey, listen, attention, you couldn't get their attention. But you would get somebody in there who was a newcomer and who just gave it their all and whose voice cracked, but they, you know, and they performed with grace. Well, man, they'd stand up and give them a heck of an applause. So, yes, they were judicial. That's right.
Did you ever play an instrument, or were you inspired to play an instrument, and who was it, who inspired you to take up a certain instrument?
I did take lessons, drum lessons, when I was very young, and that was short-lived. That was short-lived. I never took music lessons again. I've always wanted to. I always wanted to learn the piano, but that never happened. And so I figured that the best thing that I could play was the radio. And I've been doing that ever since.
Why the drums?
I don't know. I like percussion. I like percussion.
Who are some of your favorite drummers to listen to and watch?
Well, you know, Chick Webb was really the source. He was a seminal player in big band drumming, and his band, you hear his recordings today of that big band, even without Ella singing. And you say, my God, how could he drive that band the way he did? And he was a little person. So certainly the source. And then, of course, you had so many others that came after him. You had Sid Catlett, of course, Cozy Cole, J.C. Hurd. You know, the list goes on, and then into the modern drummers, Max Roaches and Art Blakey.
Now, the Apollo Theater, of course, wasn't the only theater in Harlem.
No.
There were other theaters, and I'm wondering if you could tell us about some of the other theaters and maybe how their profiles were different. You know, like you went to this theater for one kind of thing, and you went to this place
Well,
for that.
the Apollo was the only one that had shows. You had shows also at the Harlem Opera House early on, but that closed for shows early. After that, you had the great movie houses, the Loews Victoria on 125th Street, the Regent on 116th Street, the Proctor, 125th Street on the east side, and on the concourse, of course, the Loews Paradise, which they've just restored. Those are great movie houses, beautiful Art Deco buildings, some of which still exist. But they were movie houses, and that was the excursion. Everybody went to movies.
So you didn't play the drums, but you did express yourself dancing, because I remember that we talked about,
Oh, yeah,
about
sure.
the dances and the Lester Leap Center, different records
That's correct.
had different moves or something.
Yes, that's right.
I wonder if you could tell us about that. Tell us about what dancing meant to you and your friends as you were in adolescence, and maybe even about some of the specific dances that you did.
Well, I can tell you about it, but you sure not going to get a demonstration. Come on, but one of my colleagues just walked in, Trevor Bannister, who is a member of my group. We've been friends for 60-something years. So I think he knows exactly about this era too. But the dancing, as I said, was part of what we did, and it was a competitive thing. And if you were hip, then you had to know how to dance. And if you were not a dancer, then you could not socialize with any girls that you wanted to cultivate. So that was your passport. That was your passport. You know, if you were a good dancer, they said, you know, he can dance. So you would get attention. So when you want motivation, you cannot get more motivation than that from a teenager. That's correct. So that's the motivation. I mean, and that was the role that dancing played, was a definite part of what was happening. Now, also, one of the reasons it was so important is because this was the age of dances. You had social clubs that gave events. You had the Guardsmen, you had the Townsmen, you had other clubs that would give dances, high-class dances, great bands, and everybody would dress up and look great. It was a wonder. You would have the Snowstorm and Shadow dance at the Renaissance Casino, a breakfast dance that started at midnight. And you had fabulous events like that, and you had great bands. And of course, at the Renaissance Casino, Andy Kirk and his Clouds of Joy was the house band, with Mary Lou Williams on the piano at that time. And then you had Vernon Andrades, who was the house band, and Fats Green. You remember Fats Green and his Calypso Troubadours? And Macbeth the Great. You know Ralph MacDonald, the great percussionist, his father had a magnificent band. It was the house band at the Renaissance Casino. And they had a basketball team there too, the professional basketball, the Wrens, which in 1939 won the Basketball Tournament of America and became the champions of the nation. And they were headquarters in the Renaissance Casino on 138th Street. In 1940, they reorganized under the name of the Washington Bears, and the coach of the famous Red Auerbach coached them in the tournament in Washington, and they won it again. So these were great professionals who had a home court at the Renaissance, and teams would come in from Philadelphia, from Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was another great sports team, not only in baseball, but basketball too. And they would compete, and you would have a basketball game and dance after, and the bands would be playing after, and people would stay for the dance. So it was a part of what was going on. The entertainment that was available to the public at that time included dances.
So it sounds like at that time Harlem was a really self-contained community. There was no need to go.
Well, no, that wasn't.
Need to go to Brooklyn or
that wasn't the case at all. Sure, there was a need to go. You could not go. You were prevented from going. And with the prejudice of the time, you had to invent and define your own institutions. Because if you were barred from a hotel downtown, then where are you going to have your kid's wedding? So we had to have a hotel. And so we had to duplicate all of these institutions that serves communities and societies. That's why you had a white this and a black that. Right. Same duplication, but never the twain shall meet. And that was one of the very ironic issues that as a result of prejudice and bias, we have black institutions because we were forced to have them. That's ironic, isn't it? A positive to come out of something so negative. But then you see when integration finally came to the institutions of New York City, there was no need to have the duplicate institutions. Since you could go to the best, why have an inferior one up here? And that's what integration did. It spread us all over. And it also sharpened something else, and that was our taste and our expectation for ourselves in what would define our success or failure. We had broadened opportunities, and so we were not just channeled in a narrow area as we were prior. When you were told in school that your ambitions were falling on deaf ears because there was no way that you could become a doctor. So you better start considering to be a teacher or to be a reverend, you know. But nobody said you should be a chemist or that you should think of being an accountant, because that was not for you. So the possibilities were so limited that one's scope was narrow. And that's what integration did. It opened you up to the possibilities. And if young people can see that there are possibilities, then there's nothing that's going to impede their progress. And that's what we're trying to do here, too, in the museum. Isn't that right, Loren? As you try to teach the youngsters the importance of this music and the preservation of it. Yes.
So you were talking about ironies, and so one of the ironies of integration then was, as you said, were all these marvelous institutions that existed here were then vitiated because there was no need for them. And that's something now that's lamented as
well, I don't lament it. I can only give you my perspective. I don't lament it at all. I think that now what we're seeing in today's reality is the realization of what our expectations were in Harlemites' minds and hearts, what they always were, because we always knew this was a great place, that it was cosmetically impaired, that it was burnt out, that it had lost its spirit, that it was crime-ridden. All of those things were true, and as soon as we stopped being in denial, we started to address the solutions to those issues and develop the political will to persuade the powers that be that need to be persuaded when development is imminent to step in and do it now. It took 35 years of concerted effort to get this development started. And it's my opinion that the pivotal factor in the redevelopment of Harlem today is the impetus and impact of Harlem Week, created by the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, who now is celebrating this year the 33rd year of Harlem Week, which lasts a month. And how I know? Because I went with Lloyd Williams 27 years ago to get sponsors to raise money to support Harlem Week, and they laughed us out of their offices because we couldn't demonstrate that it was safe to come up here. See? And it was true. And so we redoubled efforts to try to make it safer. and put demands on the police department that any thriving community is going to put. And we did, and the political will, as I say, finally came around to start this meaningful development. This is not cosmetic, this is meaningful. And the community is changed because it's no longer necessary to stay together and ghettoize your living experience. It's no longer necessary for the protection that we needed at the time, because the time I was coming up, you couldn't walk on 138th Street on Broadway across from City College, as I did with 3 friends many years ago, and was run out of there by the Irish Dukes as we ran to a policeman who was directing traffic during the graduation from CCNY, and he said, "Don't come to me, what the hell are you doing here in this neighborhood anyway?" And we had to run for our lives, and we did. See? So I know what I'm talking about when I tell you that you're in a community by necessity. And when that necessity evaporates, you become a free person, making choices, taking advantage of opportunities if your skill and talents permit. But the possibility for your children is unlimited. And that message is the most powerful message that we can give them.
Can I ask you, on a personal level, when you're in your teens, you're in high school, you're about to graduate and become an adult, what expectations did your parents have for you, or what expectations did you have for yourself?
I think that's an excellent question. The expectation that they had was that I would graduate from high school and get a good job, in quotes, whatever that meant. A good job meant that it was probably a government job, because there were very few commercial jobs available, even if you had advanced degrees and the certificates to prove it. And so those professionals that were architects, that were nurses and doctors, would go to city hospitals where they would be employed because of competitive examinations. Civil service was a great haven for us because we got equal opportunity there. We did not get it from companies. Let me give you a personal experience. I didn't go into the Korean War. I was not admitted because of my eyes, and I had a temporary job at a casualty insurance company in Brooklyn. I had, excuse me.
Want some water?
Oh, it's fine. I had just graduated from the Bronx High School of Science, and I told you in that elementary school, St. Mark's, education went on there. There were 27 graduates in that class, 13 boys and 14 girls, and 3 boys got into the Bronx High School of Science. They only admitted boys at that time. Trevor Bannister was in my class at Bronx Science, and there's Lloyd Williams coming in now. Just called your name a little while ago. It was at a time when the opportunities were very, very few, and we all were expected to go to college. But in order to go to college, you had to have money for tuition or be so smart that you got a scholarship, or you were that good an athlete that you would get a scholarship. That was not available to everybody. And so Trevor and I decided that we would go to Brooklyn College because all of our friends were in City College. And if we went to Brooklyn, we wouldn't be distracted. And that's what we did. We went to Brooklyn College at night for 4 years. And I worked in the post office and during the day. And we wanted to be, I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And we pursued those courses until I found out how much they made. Now, and where did I look? I looked in the civil service registry, because the possibility of me becoming a psychologist was only if I could pass the civil service test and go in that way, see? And so they have the salary scales and all that. So I said, damn, this is all I can make. I said, well, I don't think that this is going to work. But I wanted to continue, and I certainly did. But at that time, working in the insurance company, they asked me after I was rejected from the Army if I wanted to stay, and I said yes. And over a period of the next 22 years, I worked there. That was the only casualty insurance company that hired black people. I was the first black person hired in the casualty insurance field. Isn't that crazy? But it certainly is true. And I became the first officer of a casualty insurance company in 1963 in the nation. All right. And then I went to the Institute for Mediation and Conflict Resolution. It was a program that was run by Ted Keel and Basil Patterson, and its goal was to use the principles of negotiation, mediation, and arbitration to solve community disputes, and to see if you could use those skills to do that. And so this was a great opportunity. I took a year's leave of absence from the insurance company, and I went over there. I was fascinated, and this dynamic stuff was going on, this group dynamics. They were training wardens of prisons in conflict resolution and the best techniques. And, I mean, you know, captivating stuff. So I said, well, I'm not going back to the insurance company. So I resigned, and my mother said, what? You left the company?
Good job.
Hey, man, the company, you know. I said, yeah, man, I got to do this. And I never looked back, really. I never thought about what the consequences would be. But I was captivated by this enterprise and saw how it could be used in everyday life. I mean, everybody's doing you're negotiating with your husband, you're negotiating with your wife. In every contact that you have with another human being, it's a negotiation. And the question is, how can you be effective negotiating? And how can you solve conflict without going into battle every time there's a disagreement? And what are the group dynamics at work when protesters protest and don't know what they want? All of those things. So it was very captivating, and I stayed there for nearly 4 years until Bruce Llewellyn, who was a member of the board of directors of the New York Urban Coalition, offered my name to replace Reverend Gene Callender. And I did that. And I stayed there for 18 years. And my last job, which is the one that I'm on now, is with Hip Health Plan of New York. And that brings me to my connection to jazz organizations. So you see from my background that I was raised with this music, and I had a great love for it. I went to work for a company with the name of Hip Health Plan of New York, 60-year-old institution. Now, it didn't take me long to figure out that this is a great natural marketing tool. The music and being hip, you just go to the dictionary and look up the meaning of hip, and it says trendsetter, someone in the know, on the cutting edge. I said, that's me. And I said, that's us. And that's what I sold to Tony Watson, the CEO of HIP. And we started that campaign, and Lloyd knows all about it because he reinforced my enthusiasm with the powers that be. And sure enough, it became our slogan, now that's HIP. And we started doing support of jazz institutions. And Sandy Jackson introduced me to Veritas and Friends of Charlie Parker with Sarah Morgan. And we took a wonderful musical private party into an event that raised $400,000 a year at their gala by packaging the music, the musicians, and the presentation of something that could bring in that kind of money. And we had to make it into a corporate dinner, and that's what we did. And we were very successful with it for many, many years. And so that broke me into the music and the association with Sandy and her outreach to jazz musicians. And then I was attracted to the possibility of the Hip Jazz Concert Series. And so I went to George Wein and I said, George, I want to do some concerts and I want you to produce it. And he did. And we went to Alice Tully Hall and we did some great, great concerts there on 2 nights in a week in March. And I tell you, I was never in anything more difficult in my life, putting that together. And not only just one night, but the next night we had to do it again with a different bill. It was really quite a challenge and very, very successful, by the way. The proceeds we gave to nonprofit organizations, one of them being the Jazz Foundation of America, Wendy Oxenhorn. I gave her $110,000 proceeds from that concert. And the high school, Clara Barton High School for Health Professions in Park Slope, we gave the other $110,000 to. So that's what we did, and that's the tradition we created until we changed the format when Jazz at Lincoln Center opened in the Time Warner Building. We partnered with them to do the Hip Jazz concert, and we've been doing it in the Rose Hall for the last 2 years. So then Jazzmobile, which is now 41 years old, doing their work, was in a position of transition, the borderline of really making it to the next level or falling backwards. And under the new, its new leadership, it's really prospered. And we've been supporting Jazzmobile, the jazz program at the New School. I was chairman of the Board of Governors of that program, and Sandy Jackson again was on that Board of Governors. And we did that and brought them into the next level too. In addition, there are concerts given every year at Marcus Garvey Park, and also down at Tompkins Square Park. And the group that was doing that, there again, Sandy introduced me to them, did it successfully for over 10 years until the money ran out and the sponsors were not available. So the Central Park, is it the Central Park Conservancy or the foundation? They took it over, and we continued to sponsor those 2 concerts. So I think that the record is clear. Our support of the Harlem Jazz program annually that Lloyd runs is in addition to all of the other things. We think that we have made an impact on the jazz industry and support of those institutions from which we all derive benefit. Last but not least, of course, is our jazz station, WBGO 88.3 on your dial. I was privileged to serve as their chairman of their 25th anniversary year, and all the activities that go on in a year. I don't think I'll ever do that again. You know, it's one thing for a gala, that's one event. But when they said, CFA said, well, no, this is for the year and we're going to do, it sounded terrific until you lived through it. It was harrowing, it was challenging, it was wonderfully successful. And I was very, very pleased and privileged to make that contribution to the jazz station. And that brings us right back to where we are now, Loren.
Wow.
And we have the Art Tatum of the interview here. This is wonderful. I'll tell you what, folks, you mentioned coming right back to where we were. We're going to take one of our short breaks. We have some food and some water and stuff, and then we'll come back for a second part. But I'm wondering if I could presume upon, I don't know if it's fair to ask, we have the chairman of the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, who we were actually talking about even before he came in the room.
That's right.
I'm wondering if you would come up and say a word or two to Mr. Barnes. This is Lloyd Williams, ladies and gentlemen.
I won't take your time. Food break, water break. So believe me, I will let you break. All I can tell you is, I have learned so much decent, professional, quality things from Arthur Barnes. I call him Houdini. He is a magic man. He's a true rock of Harlem. And just being here is very important. Loren and I've been close for a couple of years now. And the person who brought us together, Len Garment. And so it's just great to be here. And Sandy's been mentioned a few times. You know, in this community, there are a lot of outstanding leaders. Many oftentimes are the men who get up and hold the mic. But the true rocks and pillars of this community are the women. And I truly mean that. And I want to thank you, ladies, for slapping us and getting us in place and reminding us about what we're supposed to do and keeping us focused on our heritage, our culture, and our mission. And I'm going to sit back and just listen to the rest of the program. Thank you. Thank you.
Our founding chairman, one of the great heroes for American culture in ways that you'll never know about, Leonard Garment, right back here. This guy's done more.
Hey, Leonard.
Done so much. You know, there'd be no National Endowment of the Arts or Humanities as we know them today if it wasn't for what Mr. Garment did in his years in Washington. That's just a start. But anyway, what we frequently say, Ade, how are you? Okay. What we frequently say is, what happens at the Jazz Museum? Well, actually, I should also mention to the audience we have Mr. Barnes is on our advisory board, and another member of our advisory board who also is really instrumental in many ways with the Jazz Museum, especially in terms of our relations with the Children's Aid Society, another kind of hero for the arts, Melina Jackson. Miss Sandy Jackson, who we tried to have as our guest. We're going to set a date and get you up here to get your story.
That's my other mom now. Please give her a round of applause.
Legendary Sandy Jackson, ladies and gentlemen. But I'll tell you one thing that gives me great solace, ladies and gentlemen, and that's knowing that we have discovered, not that we've discovered, you have brought to us the necessary DNA, if I can put it that way, for a thriving cultural institution. And the way that I know it is, we all know because we all go to events, we all go to concerts, we all go to interviews. And how many times do they take an intermission at a place and everyone sits like this, like, nobody really talks, and they stand on the line and they, excuse me. You know, you can't stop people from having a good time at these things. And that's what makes me know every day that when we can get a building, and I will say that we are looking at a building right now on Lenox Avenue, hopefully to have a home for our archives, for our community, things that we do in concert with the Harlem Arts Alliance, which will be sharing our space. And our exhibit space, our archives, musicians are giving us collections as we speak. The president of the International Duke Ellington Society has donated his entire collection to the Jazz Museum in Harlem, and a day doesn't go by where we don't get a phone call of someone who wants to help make this happen. When we get the home to put it in, a floor of exhibit space, a floor of community space to be shared with community arts organizations, office space, and for our children's programs. This is where we're headed, and this is why I know that what's happening on these Thursday evenings, all these many weeks. I'd like to mention that in 2 weeks we're having the cornetist and guitarist and historian Olu Dara will be here. Coming up after that, the legendary Hank Jones. And that's just for starters. But that's all in the future. We're here today with Arthur Barnes, and I'd like, Arthur, if I could, because as we concluded the first half of the interview, you kind of took us up to the present time. And I'm wondering if I can ratchet the clock back just for a moment. We are going to open it up for questions and comments from the audience, as we always do. But Christian asked a fascinating question to which you gave an equally fascinating answer when he asked you about what were your parents' expectations for you during your teen years, and how did that all change? Well, you were born in 1930, so that would mean that you were, during the Second World War, 10, 11, 12, 13, right. 14, 15. And I know that in some ways those were rocky years for Harlem too, in certain ways.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about your experiences as a teenager growing up in the Harlem of World War II and what happened during those years.
You were certainly right. It was a very dynamic time. You can imagine, with the war going on, the headlines every day about the Axis powers moving into another European country, the United States and Britain and the Allies, including France, fighting the good on God's side, as Joe Louis said. The pressures in the community were great. Unemployment was still high, and this is before the great defense industries were mobilized, and employment was then pretty universal, including women for the first time being recruited to the workforce. That was revolutionary. And it did emancipate a lot of women in our society and gave them an independent posture and an independent point of view, because remember now, they were no longer sitting at home waiting for somebody to, in quotes, support them, which was how it was expressed. But they were breadwinners themselves, and therefore they took it upon themselves to change their attitude and started making their own decisions. So that was a very impactful time. And then as the soldiers and sailors returned, as the stories of heroism came back here, it brings to mind the story of the first black recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, which was Dory Miller. And it happened as he was a cook in the Navy. At this time, you could not be anything but a cook or a steward in the United States Navy. And when the Japanese kamikaze warplanes were strafing the ships in Pearl Harbor, he ran to a slain sailor, gunner, pushed him his body out of the way, manned the gun, and knocked down 2 Japanese planes and saved hundreds of his colleagues, giving his own life. In Queens, in Jamaica, there is the Dory Miller Houses. It was a federal project like the Harlem River houses that we have on 150, from 149th Street to 153rd Street. Those were federal projects. And I might say to you that at that time they were built, the war was on, they were in their infancy, and from all over Harlem, they were looked at as modern houses and a place that people aspired to get in, just as they did with the Graham Court and the Dunbar. The Dunbar, across the street from the Harlem River houses, was built by David Rockefeller's family. And it was an answer to the protests that blacks gave at that time to protest the building of Stuyvesant Town, and they would not allow black people in Stuyvesant Town. And so Lloyd will tell you also, because the chamber at that time was an advocating for similar kinds of livable housing. In fact, at that time, that was a luxurious housing. And in answer to that protest, but they didn't change metropolitan life Insurance's policy, so he built the Dunbar. And that was to give the black community an upgrade in their housing. It certainly did. That was a beautiful housing development. But the returning soldiers came back and revolutionized our society as we knew it, because they were no longer complacent about their position in American society. They had risked their lives. They had suffered indignities in the armed forces. They were allowed only the most menial jobs. If you were in the Army, it was the quartermasters. You could drive a truck, you could load, unload it, you could cook, but you couldn't shoot a rifle. And so when I was 17, in 1947, it was then and only then that the armed forces were desegregated. This is after World War II, not during. And that residue that existed was ameliorated slightly by those of us who could take advantage of the GI Bill of Rights, which enabled them, so many, to get mortgages for their own homes and education in institutions of higher learning, college educations. That was one of the good parts of being in the Army, one of the few.
You mentioned that back during the 40s, all the folks who lived in Harlem, I guess you had access to W.E.B. Du Bois's and the Paul Robesons and the Sugar Ray Robinsons and the Joe Lewises and all these various people who were living in the community at that time. And I'm wondering if you could share experiences you may have had as a young man running in or seeing some of these.
It was fascinating because, you see, we only had radio, we had no television. You would have movies of a fight, but it's very difficult to convey to young people today the magnitude of the stardom that Joe Louis had. You know, this was a time in our society when black people had very few heroes, and those that were identified as heroes always seemed to have clay feet. There was always something wrong, you know. You had very, very dynamic personalities, but there was no personality or title in our society that had more power to it than heavyweight champion of the world. And it was an anomaly, really, for our times to think that a prize fighter could have all of that influence. But as you look at it, it really was superficial. There was very little influence that Joe Louis ever had, except to be gracious, except to be generous, except to support our armed forces to a fault where he fought bouts, risked his title, and gave his purse to the Navy, to the Army, you know, and wasn't it he that the government made an economic cripple by charging him taxes on the purses he gave to the government? And in the absence of payment, the penalty mounted and bankrupted him ultimately. So that was the time that we're talking about, Loren. On the one hand, you know, we were insulated in our own community. Life went on for us. We were able to make it. We did what we had to do. And when these armed forces veterans came back and told us that there was a whole different horizon out there and that they weren't going to be kept in one community because they were going out to take advantage of the opportunities that they had won by their blood, sweat, and tears. And they certainly did. And it emancipated us in our thinking about ourselves, about our children, about our futures.
Father, I'd like to ask you, as well as Loren, or whoever else would like to jump in and answer this. From a personal standpoint, how did your taste change? You talk about Joe Louis and all of the great heroes, particularly in Harlem, of your childhood, the Sugar Ray Robinsons, the Joe Lewises, the, excuse me, all of the legendary black figures of that time. Talk about the transition from that era to, say, the 60s, when you had a heavyweight champion like Muhammad Ali, who was in many ways the exact opposite of Joe Louis. And then now, instead of musical heroes like Duke Ellington and Count Basie, Cab Calloway, Lionel Hampton, now you got James Brown, The Temptations, Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin. The whole musical landscape had begun to change and be a little different. Was that difficult for you as the next generation started to be
No, it wasn't difficult at all, because we gave them no credibility. We gave them no credibility, and I say that in all seriousness because remember now, I'm talking originally about the bebop era, the revolutionary era, where the young musicians devised a new way of playing that was very difficult, very complex, and very our own thing kind of an attitude about it. And so they adopted their dress, they adapted their dress to coincide with their attitude about their music. And everything was to be conservative. You were to be in a jacket and tie on the stage. You were to give a performance that was a performance of your music and your musicianship, not of your ability to make people laugh. And it was serious, it was to be taken serious, and therefore they wanted to look the part. Have you all in your mind's eye, are you able to conjure up an album cover of the Modern Jazz Quartet? You see those four distinguished looking gentlemen nodded down. I mean, they were ready, weren't they? And that was the image of the music, that new music at that time. So yes, they came back to us, changed. They came back to change us and our taste in music, and for us to develop a broader perspective in what we considered to be entertaining. It switched from participation of dancing to observation in concerts. And that was the death knell of big band jazz as we knew it. Because there was no concert that could support large aggregations. How are you going to have 20 musicians, 18 musicians traveling around night after night, and the receipts at the door was supposed to pay for those expenses? It couldn't happen. It only happened and was only possible with one genius of an individual, Duke Ellington, who financed his band from his own royalties and said, what is a composer to do if he has no orchestra to play his music? And I am so fortunate. I write it tonight, tomorrow I hear it. And he kept that band and he financed it because he was able economically to do it. The other bands went by the wayside. And I'm talking about white bands, black bands at that time. In the transition to bebop, of course, Dizzy Gillespie was doing a lot of arranging for Woody Herman. And you had great arrangements being done for Benny Goodman and the great, no, not Cy Oliver. I'm talking about Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher Henderson was the one that did such great work on the arrangements for Benny Goodman and others. But yeah, the death knell of the big band was sounded at that time, and the record companies too had a very big part in that demise. And it became a part of the new music to have smaller aggregations. So you would have trios, you would have quartets and quintets. And they would experiment with different configurations, and it was more economical. And of course, in that time too, Christian, and getting back to your question, which is so difficult to answer, because there is no comparison that can be made when you compare apples to apples. When you take a set of circumstances out of that time period, you cannot put it into another time period because it doesn't have the same impact. In this instance, the credibility that Joe Louis had as a heavyweight champion was not shared by anybody else, not even Ali. He had worldwide appeal, but Joe Louis was our champion, and an identification with him that was a phenomenon that was really unbelievable. What would happen when he fought, the radios that would be on, the mobs of people in the street, it was a celebration that was unbelievable. You thought it was a riot going on, but a positive riot. And he had that kind of charisma. And of course, we needed so badly somebody to be a hero, to stand up for us that had the respect of white people. You see? And that was the hunger that we had. And that was satisfied by Joe Louis. Yeah. When you have the other stars you named, there was no comparison to the stature that he had as an individual and as an influence in this country. But it was only superficial, right. And it was given lip service by whoever was in the White House. Right. You see? And they said that they anointed him, and that was the only thing, the only person we had, and we rallied around that flag. We were loyal, yeah. And he was loyal to us.
I think one of the main reasons I was asking that question is because depending on who you talk to, you hear people say things like, you know, the death of the big band era, you know, there was no more dancing and jazz, and, you know, more of the R&B scene came and started to take over the community. Depending on who you talk to, that could either be a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I talked to people who were maybe in their teens in the 60s, yeah. And they say, oh boy, what a great era the 60s were. I got to go to the Apollo and see James. And
yes.
I got to hear a young George Benson play with Lonnie Smith's organ yeah. trio, or I got to hear Miles with Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock, whereas the generation before you might hear, you know, oh man, I hated James Brown, you know, I yeah. hated when Coltrane left Miles' band, you yeah. know, went down here after that. So I always like to hear from different perspectives, like in that period when things started to change.
Well, you see, when it changes, it doesn't change suddenly. And when it's changing, you're not aware that it's changing. It's only in afterthought that you say, oh, that's what that was.
Right.
You see, when you stand and look at it from a distance, when it's happening to you and you're living it, it's just part of your everyday life. The change to rhythm and blues, the emphasis on the blues idiom, I think that Count Basie was very, very responsible for that, bringing that sound from Kansas City, Big Joe Turner singing with him. It was the age of blues with jazz orchestration. It was blues with a big band, not just a guitar, or blues in the folk sense. Muddy Waters and those great artists. This was big band blues. Joe Williams, when he sang Every Day, it wasn't the blues that we were thinking and expecting from Robert Johnson.
Like Delta blues, right.
It wasn't Delta. Right. It was Chicago blues. Right. And before him, Jimmy Rushing. Right. You know, when he sent for you yesterday and here you come today.
Take me back, baby.
Yes, indeed. So all of that blends in now with the pure jazz that we're talking. There's nothing that's pure about jazz. And there's nothing that is all black about jazz. While we claim it, and while we've contributed a lot to it, it's an amalgam of so many kinds of music that we were exposed to, and the influence that we brought to the mix. Because that's what this is. This is a mix, and it's universal. And you hear people talk about world beat and how that's not this and it's not that, and then fusion, and then the other categories and genres of the music. There's only two kinds of music, good music and bad music. I don't care what they call it, and they've got to put it in a category so they can count you and account for you and make sure that you don't overstep where they think you should be. They meaning the powers that be that make the decisions that define the industry that we're describing. Except you have some breakout artists, which you never had before. Now it's possible to have breakout artists, entertainers, and athletes. You have Oprah Winfrey. You've got Tiger Woods. And you got Michael Jordan. And they transcend race in this country. Phenomena. It's a phenomenon. They transcend race in this country. Now, isn't that amazing? They didn't have that years ago. There was no breakout personalities like that. You had no black billionaires. You know, you had Madam Walker that they would trot out as an example of economic development. And Bill Robinson, exactly. Bill Robinson, the great tap dancer. And the influence he had on New York politics was unbelievable. Very, very influential. But that was local politics.
Could you talk about the Teresa for a moment?
Oh.
And what it represented in its heyday?
Well, the Teresa was an institution that everybody has a story about. It was the best hotel in Harlem. It had a ballroom on the roof. It was where we got married. It was where you had receptions and dances and celebrations. It was a top flight, upscale place that people were proud to have their affairs in. In fact, I was married in the Teresa too. Well, that's for another conversation.
Let's do it now.
But
your wedding.
But the Teresa had a hell of a history. Of course, Castro stayed there, and they had front page of all the papers. The individuals that would, well, when the fighters came in, they would stay at the Teresa. The great entertainers would stay there too. And it had a cachet. It had a great bar downstairs. And across the street, of course, was the Shalimar. And then down the street was Ray Robinson's whole complex, including Sugar Ray's. So there was a lot of things happening up and down 7th Avenue and in 125th Street.
Could you talk about a place that always gets a special mention every time we discuss it, which is Small's Paradise?
Mm.
And what was it that made Smalls?
Personalities, people. Ed Smalls, to begin with, was a hell of a personality. He was described as an illiterate Southern man that came to New York with smarts that nobody thought he could have, and they underestimated him in everything he did until they turned around and saw that he had their pocketbook. And he created a business. It was the one that we know, Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue, was not his original. His original was on 5th Avenue, 135th Street. And it moved to 7th Avenue, and it became an institution. And there again, you see, our society was made up by a strong cult of personality. We had strong personalities in our community, and they prevailed. You had, as we mentioned before, Bill Bojangles Robinson, who was an icon in New York City. And some of the other famous people at that time also had that kind of stature. And of course, those were the sportsmen, you know. And in Amsterdam, Harlem sportsmen. That was the description. But that's who they were, and they of course made big contributions to the local community and economy.
Now, Wilt Chamberlain later took over Smalls.
Yes, he did.
Now, was there still live music there when
Yes.
he took over
Yes.
ownership?
Yes, he did. He had a partner, Pete McDougal. And Wilt, of course, being the great basketball star that he was, lent his name to Wilt's Small's Paradise. And the business was not as successful when he took it over as when Ed Smalls had it. See? And the personalities that ran it, you see in every one of those establishments, and it's the same elements for success exist today. The personality of who's running the place, whether it was Jock's Place with Rusty Falk, or whether it was Small's Paradise with Teddy Butler, those personalities governed what took place. They supervised and created and controlled the good times that happened in this place. It just didn't happen. They programmed all of those things. And if you were in Jocks at that time, as we were as young teenagers after we were 18, and Charlie Rangel was doing his homework in the back of Jocks and hurrying up so that he could finish it because Billy Daniels was going to be appearing there with Benny Payne on piano, same Benny Payne from Cab Calloway's band, who accompanied this great singer. And you know, this was the environment that we grew up in. Across the street at Dickie Wells, there was a whole other group over there. And each place, Jocks was right next door to the Red Rooster, and they had different crowds. And if you went to Jocks, you didn't go to the Red Rooster, and vice versa. The personalities that ran the place was the affinity that you had to the place. This person treated you well, you made friends, those were who you went to visit. Next door was a whole different crowd. And that was the kind of partisanship that existed with two establishments right next door to each other. So you know, if you were from uptown and you went down to 116th Street, it was like going to Philadelphia.
Wow.
And of course, Minton's Playhouse bridged the gap. And Minton's Playhouse then was an institution to us because we used to stay on the side. They opened the door for ventilation, and we would be beside the door, so when it opened, we could see in there. And the group of us that would go and hang out there would change places. Those that were in the front, after a set, would go to the back, and you'd shift so that everybody would have a chance to at least eavesdrop on what was happening in Minton's. And that's how we identified the bebop and new young musicians.
I also have a question I'd like to ask about your early days. Speaking about Joe Louis and what he meant to Black America, tell us, do you remember exactly where you were when you found out the Brooklyn Dodgers had called up Jackie Robinson?
Yeah, I remember that.
What did that mean to you personally?
Well,
especially since your father
was
briefly on the New York Black Yankees.
That's right. It was very impactful to me because I had seen Jackie Robinson play, as I had seen Roy Campanella play for the Homestead Grays, and there were a whole cadre of great baseball players. So that when Jackie Robinson made it, the argument that went on in Harlem was that he was not, why did they pick him? He was not the best player. They should have picked so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. But you see, he had the whole package, and that's what they were doing. They presented the best representative of the black community that they could find, and in this field, and it was Jackie Robinson.
So are you saying somewhat that the reaction may not have been quite as
unanimous?
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying that. It was unanimous. But then you see, you have people, especially in our community, that when they have a story, or they hear a story, or they see a set of situations, then after a while they go into the laboratory and they make their own experiments and come to their own conclusions and analysis, and they say, I know what really happened. And that was so-and-so. So have no basis in fact at all, conjecture. And we can conject like crazy.
I'd like to ask about one figure, just to see what he represented to people of your generation. I think he became famous just as you became, you know, a late teenager, and that would be Billy Eckstine.
Well,
and he was really something different from everybody before him, right? What made him unique?
Billy Eckstine, I'm glad you bring him up. Billy Eckstine was a phenomenal individual, musician, vocalist, trendsetter, and he was a phenomenally popular entertainer in the Harlem community. He lived right up here on 126th Street, off Fifth Avenue. And his popularity came at a time when black vocalists were not privileged to sing love songs on the radio. And so as black vocalists, they had to be specialists of the blues. And his great successful tune, of course, was Jelly Jelly, right? And that was a fantastic hit. But remember now, we have the category, so he was a fantastic hit on Race Records, which was a separate label. That's exactly what it was. But he was a very, very big star, tremendous talent, a would-be instrumentalist because he tried to play the trumpet, he tried to play the valve trombone, and then he ended up playing the guitar toward the last part of his career, but with a voice that set a standard for black vocalists, like Frank Sinatra did with white vocalists. Every black vocalist after Billy Eckstine sounded like Billy Eckstine's vibrato. And his closest rival was Arthur Prysock. A great star in his own right. Arthur Prysock, Lee Richardson, all of them that you can name who were prominent at that time, with the exception of those vocalists that played, for instance, with Tony Bradshaw, like Trevor Bacon, who had a high baritone voice. His great number was when the Boys Come Home Again, all over the world. Very big hit by Lucky Millinder. And Trevor Bacon had that beautiful, smooth, light voice that became popular also.
Were you into the doo-wop groups at all at that time?
Not then, no, that came way after. That came way later.
But they were somewhat of an offshoot of like the great singers, like Billy, like you take a singer like...
Entirely different, entirely different. Billy Eckstine then started singing ballads, and his greatest hits on big major record labels were ballads. Prisoner of Love and all of those were great, great hits of his. But in his formative years that Loren asked me about, that was when he was limited, and he went on to have one of the greatest bebop bands ever put together. He had a band that included Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Gene Ammons, Wardell Gray, Dexter Gordon, Art Blakey on drums, John Lewis on piano, and Sarah Vaughan as the vocalist, singing with Billy Eckstine. Well, their first duets together came with Earl Hines. When she was 16, she played at the Apollo opposite Billy Eckstine. Can you imagine it? This little kid from Newark. And even then, we knew she was going to be unbelievable. Yep.
This is the time, folks, when we usually open it up for questions and or comments from the audience. So we'll give you that opportunity. Anyone want to add anything? Becca Pulliam.
I have a question. Adam Clayton Powell, can you recall, his career over a period of a couple of decades? His position?
How long have you got?
She asked about Adam Clayton Powell. That's a great question.
Sure, Adam Clayton Powell's shadow was on all of the events that I mentioned. He was the stalwart advocate of the black community in New York City in the late 30s, early 40s, as an assistant pastor at his father's church, Abyssinia Baptist Church, which had recently moved to its present location from San Juan Hill, 66th Street, which was the black community before Harlem became the black community. And that's where Abyssinia came from. The congregations followed it, and then more were added. And being the largest at that time, at one time, it was the largest Protestant congregation in the nation, and he headed that church, so he had a great number of constituents. He could generate a lot of votes, and he had political power, real political power. And his impact was very great. He was a very effective congressman at the beginning. His accomplishments were varied, and as a politician in a segregated Congress, who knows what was in his DNA that brought him to the brink of his sanity? Or was it the pressure of the environment in which he had to function, where he couldn't go to the congressional barbershop or eat in the congressional dining room? So what element was it that was so insidious that it drove him over the top? And it certainly did, because he did go over the top. And at the end, his impact was lightened by his withdrawal from the scene and his ill health. But at his heyday, he's the one that integrated 125th Street. You had all of those stores that were there. Woolworths, Weisbeckers, yes, yes, all of them. The hospital staffs also were integrated through his advocacy. And yes, he was a very positive force during those years.
Walter?
Mr. Barnes, I have to go back to the days of the Apollo, and I'll tell you why. When I was a young kid, back in the 60s, I'll never forget the first time I went there. There was Slick Wilson and Nina Simone on the same bill. Then years later, not too long ago, the Apollo almost closed. You know, then the board came back. I don't know if it was then Mayor Dinkins. They almost lost the Apollo. Can you tell me what happened, if you had anything to do with it? And then Billy Daniels, when I saw Sammy Davis Jr., he was saying to Billy Daniels, we're going to go up to Harlem and see a show or something. I'd like to know your thoughts about that.
Well, I think that's the most difficult question I've had tonight. My thoughts about it?
Right.
I would really ask you to try to frame that a little narrower so that I can get my arms around that one. That's very, very broad. Very broad.
Well,
Make it more specific.
okay. Well, with the Apollo, we
Yeah.
almost lost the Apollo.
Well, we didn't, yes.
Right.
What happened
There was
was,
a board that tried to save it.
all right, let me
Right.
try to answer that. The Apollo has never been economically sound as an investment in today's modern world. You couldn't charge enough for admission to be able to pay the acts that you would attract to that very estimable house. And so it was decided, after Percy Sutton had lost some $27 million in running the Apollo, that they would turn it into a nonprofit arts and cultural center, and with that nonprofit designation, raise money to continue its support. And so a board of directors was formed, and I was on that board, and we set about the operation of the Apollo and getting in the funds to be able to do that. Over a period of time, the Apollo functioned on a limited basis. There were extensive renovations needed. The board, under the direction of its chairman, Dick Parsons, CEO of Time Warner, raised the money for those necessary renovations, organized a new board of directors, and is functioning and operating the Apollo as we speak. The new sign outside, you know, what do they call the marquee outside is brand new. The chairs, the whole the whole thing has been refurbished. And a successful operation is expected by all. The crisis is over.
I could sit and listen to you all night because you're so informative. I have a question. Was Wilbur Tatum, the owner of the Amsterdam News, wasn't he the president of HIP at one time?
No. No, Wilbur Tatum was a vice president for marketing at HIP for several years before he invested in the group that bought the Amsterdam News.
Because when I was a student in college, I went there to interview him, I believe, that building on 57th
58th Street. Yes, he was a vice president for marketing.
Oh, that's what he was.
Yes, that's what he was.
Any other comments, questions?
I'd like to make a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about Docs and the Red Rooster, and the fact that it had, each had their own set of clientele.
Yep.
And then someone brought up Adam. I would like to comment that Adam
Was a
went
Red
to
Rooster
both
guy.
the Jocks and
Yeah, he did. He did, but you know, the 800-pound gorilla sits wherever he wants. I'm talking about average people, you and me. You know? Anybody else?
Question, Dan?
Yes, sir, my question relates to when most historians look at Harlem from downtown,
Yes.
they see only one race.
Yes.
But since I've worked in Harlem and I've been promoting a number of clubs, including Copeland's, recently reopening Mittens and doing publicity, and a new club on the east side, Creole Restaurant, I've discovered that there are certain specific ethnic neighborhoods in Harlem. So my question to you is, can you explain how that ethnicity was a major part, I believe, of Harlem, and that Cab Calloway, for example, and his band, according to stories that Doc Cheatham tells me, were made up of many Native Americans as a group, and basically, as they traveled, they attracted Native American cultures, and we have a huge Caribbean population in Harlem, which is also looks the same, but it's very different. So the other question is the Latin music influence in the Harlem culture. So could you address those things as you went to the various clubs?
Let me, if you don't mind, just hit it from the perspective of what you said most historians, misnomer. Because a historian would know about this community. So, and if you are talking about someone who calls himself a historian, then you're talking about someone who has most recently given themselves a temporary title. The issue in terms of this community, and others can tell you, we are very, very, very proud of the Irish, very, very proud of the Italians, very, very proud of the Puerto Ricans, of the Cubans, of the Chinese, and on and on and on. And then, of course, the Caribbeans, whether they are the Jamaicans, the Trinidadians, the Grenadines, Barbadians, the people from the Virgin Islands like Arthur and myself from the Jamaican, all of that. So therefore it is an international community. It has always been an international community. So we understand that the east side is 116th, 120th, 112th, 110th is the Italian. We understand where the Irish are. We understand where the Germans are. We understand where the Jews are. And it is all of that that has made Harlem the international capital of the world. Now we are, of course, having an influx of Africans from East and West Africa, and of course Mexicans, and of course people from Brazil, and all of those things that make up what is an international community. So,
Lloyd, let me just add something to that, right? Segue into that. Harlem is no different. Harlem is a part of the tapestry of New York City. The history of New York City is the history of Harlem. You had immigrants populate this great city in waves. And so too, we have immigrants coming into Harlem in waves. All you have to do is to walk down the streets and you see a different Harlem than you saw 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago. So we've always been a polyglot of immigrants. We were not the first ones to inhabit this area we call Harlem, you see. The Rudin family was born on 111th Street on Lenox Avenue. So they were here, okay? We also had an influx of black people into this community, and it's ironic. Take 135th Street between Lenox and 7th Avenue. There's a row of houses across the street from the YMCA. Those houses were recently redeveloped by St. Philip's Church. Well, 70 years ago, St. Philip's Church bought those houses and opened them up to black immigrants coming north from San Juan Hill, which is where they lived. And before San Juan Hill in the 60s, they lived on 33rd Street in what was called the Tenderloin, which was a sin city.
Hell's Kitchen.
Hell's Kitchen. And why do you think they called it Hell's Kitchen? You'd be crazy to walk through it. So it was those kinds of neighborhoods that people migrated because, number one, they had new attractive apartments and they were being sold and focused on them by the real estate interests because nobody else would move that far. And as Lloyd so aptly points out in all of his talks about transit and transportation in Harlem, it was the best situated community in the city. It had all the lines of transportation, 3 subway lines and a myriad number of bus lines and crosstown buses. You could get from Wall Street to 125th Street in 15 minutes. That was the advertisement, you see? So that's how it happens. People come where there's opportunity. If I can find an affordable house in a good neighborhood, I'm taking my family. If I can find a job, I'm going to move where that job is. That's the reason that people move, and that's the reason they populated Harlem. And that's the reason they're populating it now.
Well, my question, I believe, was directed more because you were giving a history of the music.
Yes.
And you had all these wonderful personal experiences with
Yes.
music. So my question to you was really about, did you recognize the ethnicity within the music as it was changing and recognize the ethnicity of the musicians?
Not only did we recognize it, we participated with it because, you know, when West Indian people came to the city, they brought their music. And the calypso music that we enjoy, you don't have to be West Indian to enjoy it, and you don't have to be Latino to enjoy salsa, and you don't have to be Brazilian to dance the samba. So it's that appreciation, it's that mixture that gives us strength. And the influx of the African inhabitants of 116th Street and that environment is a very enriching cultural phenomena that we're going through. And we're going to be the beneficiaries of that, as New York City is the beneficiary of all of us being here.
Arthur, if I can just say this, you spoke of so well. It was mesmerizing. I just want to just say to everyone what Arthur has done over the decades to bring the cultures together. Arthur is one of the persons who was the foremost advocate of the Latin music form connecting better with the African music form, the Caribbean American music form. And I mean, I really just need to give you credit because of the Machitos and because of the Titos and the Pachecos and Barretos and everyone,
That's right.
Graciela,
Yes.
and everybody who you brought together to share these cross-pollination of music experience. I just want to thank you.
Thank you, Loren.
One more thing to say. Amen to all of that. This is my man from 1945, and Milk was my man. I've been in your house playing too
I
much.
know you've been in my house playing
He's got
pool.
the chair. But one day you should just come off the cuff, see, because see how he is, man. He's powerful. But you should hear it. I mean, it just jumps out of us. You only get it by osmosis.
Okay, Trev.
I'll call you.
Take care, buddy. Thanks.
Well, I'll tell you, folks, I think we
You
have found out.
talked about
I'm sorry,
the
Ron.
West Indian influence
Yes.
in the music,
Yes.
and then you talked about Old San Juan Hill.
Yes.
I'm into this Thelonious Monk thing,
Right.
as you know. So, but Monk was raised in San Juan Hill, and
That's right.
what was the influence? Talk about the influence of his music with the West Indian culture.
Well, Thelonious Monk's music was not identified in that fashion at all. In fact, everyone did not know that he was West Indian. People knew that Sonny Rollins was West Indian because of his recording of St. Thomas. And he told the public that that's my roots. But I was not aware that Thelonious was West Indian until very much
No, he was
later.
born in North Carolina.
Yeah, I know.
But he was raised in that area.
In that area.
Oh,
Yeah.
and-
So I'm sure, listen, you heard Bimshire
Swing.
Swing,
Right, yeah.
and that's a direct influence of the Caribbean area in which he was raised. And Short was there. Anything that you're exposed to in those formative years that have an impact on your psyche, it influences what you do after. You may never be the same after you've heard something or seen or experienced something, and you incorporate that in your own psyche, and that becomes part of you.
Because you were chasing that one particular gal out there too.
That always was the motivating factor.
Always.
Always, yeah.
In the back, sir. Oh, yes, of course.
Arthur, what do you attribute the demise of so many of the ballrooms that had, for instance, the Renaissance and the Rockland Palace and the Palm Cafe, those great gathering places where
Yeah.
people could come and
Well-
socialize and dance. And now I would have a hard time thinking of any real ballroom up here.
That's true. Adamola, what happened to those places is the same thing that happened to the big bands. They became obsolete. When you don't make money by running a particular enterprise, then you close that enterprise and you get on out of there. And that's exactly what they did. There was nobody giving dances. There was nobody. Actually, what happened to the Renaissance and killed the Renaissance was there was no place to park. You go to the Renaissance Casino, and what did you do with your car? And 9 times out of 10, if it was in the recent years, say in the last 20 years, you had moved away from here. You got to come in by car. If you can't park it, what are you going to do? So you don't go. And that's what happens. When people when they stop coming from distances, then the local traffic can't sustain it, and they go out of business. It's all economics. They love to do it. There are people who have an inspiration. They want to do it. They got a few dollars. They want to invest it, but it's crazy to invest it in something like that unless you have first cultivated an environment in which you have an audience that will sustain that effort. And that's why you have plays on Broadway now being sponsored by Disney. They need a sponsor because they can't charge you enough to pay for the production. So Disney says, here's $5 million. Go create Aladdin. And everybody's working. You see what I mean? So if they waited for the ticket prices, they could never launch the production. That's the reason for sponsorships and the importance of sponsorships. In nonprofit endeavors, you can raise money from foundations and and those kinds of sources. But you can't make the money to sustain this operation by charging admission to come in here. So you've got to have a sponsor. And that's what this institution needs. And it will get it too. If everybody here puts their shoulder to the wheel to see that this continues, in order for it to continue, we're going to have to put up an investment. And if we invest in it, then we own a piece of it. It becomes our institution. Remember, the name of this is the National Jazz Museum of Harlem. If it's going to be national, we're going to have a part of it. And the only way you get a part of it is by investing your resources. If you don't put no money up, it's not yours. If you didn't buy that apartment, you're paying rent. When you buy it, you protect it, don't you? Don't you? And you improve it. And that's what we've got to do here. It's very, very simple. This is wonderful. I love the audience, the attention, the time to do this. It's wonderful, very gratifying. I got an ego injection that'll last me for the next 20 years. All right? But I tell you the same adage that my father told me: romance without finance is a nuisance. You understand? So if you want a jazz museum, if you want the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, you're going to have to make an investment. And we're going to have memberships available so that we can invest in this enterprise. Because without that investment, we're not going to be successful. And we want people to come from other places to find out how we did it. For figuring out now how we're going to do it. But we can't do it without you. And that's the most important thing I've said tonight. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Loren. Thanks very much. Yeah. Oh, man. You worked me to death tonight, man.
Right at the camera. Okay, here we go. One more, please. Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Loren. Thank you, Christian.